Okay, welcome everybody. This is the second session in our 2026 programme, and we're very pleased to welcome Tim Wharton and Menyang Chu. I'm going to keep the introduction short so as to give them as much time as possible to talk about their ideas, but they're going to be talking to us today about work relating to Tim's Leverhulme funded project titled Searching for Relevance, Pragmatics and Effective Science. So over to Tim and Menyang.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Ryoko. Thank you both for the invitation, and thank you to those of you who are here. I can see a few people, but I think there are others, and I don't know who they are. So, welcome to you all. Yeah, we're going to speak for, I don't know, 40, 45 minutes or so, and try and leave plenty of time for questions. The title of the talk is Relevance and Appraisal. And it is indeed a talk related to work that is taking place as part of my Leverhulme Trust research project, which Menyang is working on as the very able postdoc, and I'm very lucky to have her here with us. So if we could have the next slide, please. Which is not very informative. There you go. That's a better slide. So just a little bit of background on the project before I go through this slide. Some of you will know that, well, you will all know that I'm principally working in relevance theory. That's the theory in which I was raised intellectually, and I continue to work with it because I think it's the most exciting theory in pragmatics, and one of them, and cognition as well. So I believe very much in relevance theory. Some years ago, I was lucky enough to meet some colleagues working in Geneva who work on a similarly cognitive-oriented approach to emotion called appraisal theory. And we one of the, as well as the fact that it's very cognitively oriented, another common property that both relevance theory and appraisal theory have is that they both have a notion of relevance built right into the core of the theories. So that was one reason for embarking on this. Embarking on this project, which to a certain extent is all about building bridges between the two theories. For those of you who were here about a year ago, I gave a talk about relevance and appraisal in the last Relevance Researchers Network conference, and it was divided into 6 sections. I talked a little bit about pragmatics in emotion. I introduced the difference between affect and emotion, because those are 2 terms which some people use synonymously, but they're not strictly speaking synonymous. I introduced a little bit about the background on the various approaches to effective science. Then I introduced, very briefly, because it needs no introduction here, the relevance theory notion of relevance, and also the appraisal theory notion of relevance. The final section of that talk was very short, and it was entitled Moving Forward. And this talk is effectively about some of the ways that my thinking and Menyang's thinking have developed in terms of the building a bridge between relevance theory and appraisal theory. So if we could go to the next slide, Menyang. So here is what Menyang and I are thinking of as a little bit of a tension between work in pragmatics and work in effective science. We in relevance theory pragmatics are interested in explaining the comprehension and interpretation of utterances. Broadly speaking, how people infer meaning. Appraisal theory is a separate discipline. It's interested not in utterances and not in comprehension, but in the elicitation of emotions and aspects of the experience of emotions. So those are 2 separate theories working on 2 separate areas. But it's crucial to note that when it comes to what we're interested in, communication, The two processes are not separable. Um, Comprehending meaning, understanding and interpreting utterances often relies on emotions. It sometimes leads to the elicitation of emotions. Likewise, emotions affect the way that we interpret utterances. So we really, I think it's a genuine issue here that we need to, if we're going to incorporate emotion into pragmatic theories, we need to realize that these two things need somehow to be fused together. Now, of course, the relationship between rationality and emotion has a long and checkered history. Mengyang, you were telepathic there. I didn't even say next slide, please, and you went to it. So some of you who have read the book that I wrote with Louis de Saussure will know that there's a section about the ancient Greek view of philosophy. This is Plato's view of philosophy. The charioteer of the soul must hold the reins of the two horses, the one noble and the one ignoble. The noble horse is reason, according to Plato. The ignoble horse is emotion. So for Plato, reason was the thing that was the property that was important to being human. Emotions were things that had to be controlled, reined in, and kept a very close eye on. But in recent years, the relationship between rationality and emotion has been questioned. In fact, it was questioned long ago by David Hume. But a particularly interesting experiment, which I just want to draw your attention to, is an experiment which Antonio Damasio reports in his 1994 book, which is in the references. Damasio is a neurologist, and he was working with a group of patients, all of whom had damage to their ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So you can see that that's a cross section of the brain, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is a part of the brain right at the set right at the front of the skull, in the cortical structures of the brain, rather than the central structures such as the amygdala and the hippocampus and things like that. Now, Damasio was interested in these patients because the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which Mengyang is going to talk about a bit later, is implicated in emotion. I mean, actually, as with every area of the brain, it's implicated in a whole range of different things. But neurologists and affective scientists are very interested in this area of the brain. Damasio had a group of patients for whom this damage to this part of the brain meant that they had very severely impaired emotional responses. They couldn't respond effectively in all the tests that they were given. They could perform well on abstract reasoning tests and abstract logical tests. So, if you like, we have a test group of patients here who have impaired emotional responses, but near normal, logical, rational responses. And what Damasio did with this group of patients was give them a series of tests that were related, I think, to business decisions. He called them real world decision making tests. And the results were really interesting because I'm sure we can all remember times when we've had decisions to make about, practical decisions. And the advice we tend to hear is, well, don't let your emotions get too involved, keep it cool and keep it rational. But what he noticed was that this group of patients performed terribly on real world decision making tasks. The fact that they could reason and the fact that they could think logically didn't help them at all. It seemed to be that their lack of empathetic or emotional responses impacted seriously on their being able to make real world decisions. So they couldn't prioritize different issues. They took terrible risks, and it's since been found out that the VMPFC is really involved in risks and risk management. And they made lots and lots of social misjudgments. So the relationship between reason and emotion, or rationality and emotion, is much more complicated than we might think. And in the talk that I gave in May, I kind of gave a potted history of work on pragmatics and how we've tended to focus on cognition and at the expense of emotion. The thinking now among many people, certainly myself, certainly the affective scientists at the center in Geneva, but interestingly, not all affective scientists, the thinking now is that affect and emotion is very much a part of cognition. So our task is not just to fuse two different theories, but our task is to accept the fact that the domain of emotion belongs squarely within the domain of cognition. So that leads me to a few questions, and these are questions that the talk is going to address either directly or indirectly. And these, I suppose, represent the aims of what is coming in the next half an hour or so. How can we unite relevance theory and appraisal theory? There's already work being done on this. Meng Yang and I are currently writing a monograph, which is where this is the main aim. But there's also a lot of work in appraisal theory and by affective scientists who are taking seriously relevance theory and the relevance theoretic notion of relevance and trying to build bridges from their end, as it were. They work with a very particular model of cognition, and they're currently working on the way they do it is kind of slightly different. They've got all kinds of what seem to me to be quite complicated flowcharts and diagrams, but they're trying to accommodate the relevance theory notion of relevance within appraisal theory. The second question is, how do emotions play a role in the way relevance is achieved in both communicative and non-communicative scenarios? Emotions give off information. Sorry, emotional expressions give off information about our emotions, which you probably don't even want to call communication. So there's more to do with the transmission of emotion than just communication. And the final question, which is perhaps the most tricky and involves the most close attention, is what role does emotion play in relevance-seeking inferential processes, and at what stage does it enter into them? Okay, so let's go to the next slide, which I think just says relevance. So there's a brief section here of 4 or 5 slides, all of which concern the notion of relevance. The first one is from the relevance theory perspective, and then I'll talk about the appraisal theory perspective. So I want to, first of all, just to draw your attention to a slight change in terminology. The relevance theory notion of relevance has been called a whole range of different things over the past 2 years. It was called RT-REL. It was called PRAG-REL. And in fact, in the proposal for our monograph, I think Meng Yang and I used the term PRAG-REL. And it was Deirdre who pointed out that actually it's really not accurate to say that the relevance theoretic notion of relevance is a pragmatic notion, because it's defined in terms of the cognitive principle. So we're going to call we're going to call the relevance theory notion of relevance CogRel from now on, and I, at least until the next talk, will stick with that. This is telling you stuff you already know. According to relevance theory, attention and cognitive resources are allocated to the processing of information which is likely to bring about the greatest cognitive effects for the smallest processing effort. That's the way that relevance is calculated, and we're all familiar, I think, with that notion. Now, there are two things to say about the appraisal theory notion of relevance. Excuse me. The first is that actually they really don't provide a definition of what they mean by relevance. In fact, one of the principal sources of interest um, from effective scientists in relevance theory is the fact that we do have a definition, and effective scientists have never really been too concerned with providing a definition. Um, I had a discussion with one of the professors at the Swiss Centre of Effective Sciences about ordinary language philosophy, because I realized, having been doing some reading of Grice and Austin, that actually I'm really always thinking about what words mean and how trying to understand a word like relevant and what you mean by a word like relevant is a crucial part of being able to talk about anything. The appraisal theory view is very different. They simply follow a tradition which goes all the way back to ancient Greek philosophy, where emotions are accounted for in terms of what are called goal relevant properties. So, properties that help or hinder the achievement of current goals or objectives. The idea basically is that you come across some kind of stimulus in the environment, and before you have any emotional response to that stimulus, there is an unconscious appraisal which helps you decide whether it is worth having an emotional response to it. When I say whether it's worth having an emotional response to it, I sound a bit like this is all a very conscious thing. And in fact, I'm sure we've all experienced things like fear, where telling ourselves that it's not worth feeling like this does nothing to stop the fear at all. But basically, this idea of emotions being related to goal relevant properties is an old idea, and it's an idea that Richard Lazarus and Magda Arnold hit upon when they first proposed appraisal theory in the late 50s and early 60s. If we could go to the next slide, Mengyang. Now, it's important to note that in appraisal theory, relevance or goal relevance is actually only one of a whole range of variables that will play a role in eliciting an emotion. So goal relevance is one particular variable, but there are others. So, for example, the extent to which a stimulus fits with an individual's expectations is another appraisal that might be carried out and might result in an emotional state being elicited. That particular variable is called the variable of novelty. Whether an individual is able to control the consequences of a particular stimulus may lead to an emotion being elicited, and that's called the variable of control. And there are a range of different variables, and depending on who you read and what emotion you're reading about, there are many. But the idea is that different combinations of those evaluations and appraisals will lead to distinct emotions. So just to give you a couple of examples of novelty and control, to tell you the kind of thing that we have in mind, a loud bang, or let's say an email arrives unexpectedly, will elicit an emotional response from you, not necessarily because they introduce new information to you, but because they deviate from what you might be expecting or anticipating. Predictable events or routine effects tend not to cause emotions to be elicited. Okay, so that's novelty. Control. So if you're faced with somebody who is perhaps criticizing you or is doing something negative to you in some way, but you perceive that that person or that stimulus is somehow weaker than you, then you might appraise that situation as being within your control. And that will affect the kind of emotion that is elicited. So if you feel that you are in control of somebody or something that is possibly going to cause you negative um, consequences, you might respond with anger because you can assert the fact that you are in control. If it's something over which you have no control, then you might be fearful rather than angry, and there might be behaviors, fight or flight responses might be caused. If we could go to the next slide, please. Now, in appraisal theory, you might wonder where all these appraisals come from and why. Well, the reason that appraisal theory uses this selection of variables is that, well, it basically boils down to the selection problem, or which is, one version of the frame problem. Cognitive systems have to prioritize among the different stimuli that they are faced with, in our cognitive lives. So the idea of appraisals is that they function to prioritize our stimuli that we're faced with and our responses to those stimuli. Now, I think that's really interesting. And when I first discovered that about appraisal theory, that seemed to be another reason. So even aside from the fact that both theories have a notion of relevance at their core, another reason for trying to build a bridge between these two theories, because of course that's the reason why we have relevance in relevance theory. Okay, so I'm gonna present just a few slides about a unified account now, and then I'll pass on to Mingyang, who is going to talk about two particular empirical areas that we've been investigating, which we think are actually going to flesh out some of these things that I'm talking about to you, which are sort of still quite vague. So here are a couple of ideas that I think function as hypotheses. All of the stimuli that appraisal theorists treat as goal relevant are cog relevant. I've tried to think, and we've gone through many examples with affective scientists. There are no examples of stimuli that satisfy goal relevance that don't satisfy cog relevance. So in that respect, there is certainly an argument for saying that we could replace goal relevance with cog relevance. I say that we do it that way round because cog relevance has a definition. Goal relevance doesn't really have a definition and is used by many affective scientists without without their really saying precisely what it is. Another thing just to bear in mind there is that there are many things that are relevant in relevance theory terms that are not relevant because they are goal relevant. So many of the things in our daily lives that we assess or that are relevant to us are not relevant because they're concerned with a given goal or concern. So in fact, in many ways, using the relevance theory notion of relevance or cog relevance broadens out what might be relevant in appraisal theory. A further reason to, another hypothesis is that actually appraisal theorists seem quite clear that you only invoke other appraisal variables, such as novelty and control, and there are a whole range of others, if you've already identified a stimulus as having satisfied the variable of goal relevance. So these other appraisals are somehow secondary. Well, I think that kind of it follows from that cog relevance can also replace these other variables as well, or at least that would be one way of trying to think about ways of unifying the two views. Okay, if we could go to the next slide. Um, Replacing appraisal theory variables with the relevance theory notion would certainly, I think, lead to a more elegant, simpler account, and it would provide appraisal theory with the definition of relevance that it currently doesn't have. And there has to, I mean, in Dan and Deirdre's most recent paper, there's some really interesting work on the relationship between relevance and attention. And one of the main arguments or one of the main disputes in affective science is whether emotion elicitation is a top-down or a bottom-up approach. There are many people who work in what is known, many of you will have heard of Paul Ekman's basic emotion theory. That's a bottom-up theory where biology is an inherited, emotion is an inherited biological thing. So they're bottom-up processes. There are other approaches to affective science, such as the social constructivist views of Lisa Feldman Barrett, James Russell, and others, who advocate a more top-down view. They say that emotions are not natural kinds, and that actually they're constructed on the fly, as it were, according to cultural and indeed linguistic factors. If she has time, Ming Yang might say a bit more about that, but there's really interesting work in appraisal theory which says that actually appraisal theory is entirely neutral between top-down and bottom-up accounts of emotion. It works equally well with both. Okay, and the final slide from me. And this seems to me to be one of the biggest problems or challenges that we face accommodating appraisal theory. Well, not accommodating it within relevance theory. We're not trying to take over the discipline, but certainly building bridges between the two approaches. And it concerns inference. And for those of you who attended my talk last year and who've read the book, this question of inference and what constitutes inference is something that is crucial to how we can accommodate emotions into relevance theory. Because the kind of early work, certainly the work in the original book, appeared to rule out non-conceptual states. So, for example, emotions, but also on the slide here, I say images and impressions, seem to rule them out as inputs to inferential processes. So there didn't seem to be a very good way of accommodating them within the existing framework of inference. But more recent work on inference, and particularly thinking of the work by Mercier and Sperber on this, they see that non-conceptual states can be potential inputs to inferential processes and that they can contribute directly to relevance. So emotions can play a role, and I would argue they do, but the question is how and what insights can we gain about the way that emotion and cognition work together. And I'll pass on to Ming Yang now, who has some really interesting ideas taken from two main areas of empirical work, which we're thinking about at the moment. So I'll hand over now to Ming Yang. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Tim, for introducing the theoretical stuff. And for the next few slides, I'll be talking about two empirical interfaces. One is, so they're both recent works. One is about the tonemes and emotional prosody in tonal languages, such as Mandarin Chinese. and the other one done by a few researchers at the center in Geneva, which is an fMRI study on how emotional signals are weighted and integrated during the production of emotional prosody. And we sort of believe that these two interfaces may inform the architecture of appraisal in the search for relevance. So the first one about tonemes and emotional prosody, then the first question would be why we need to study tonal languages. A quick fact is that more than half of the languages in the world are actually tonal languages, meaning that tonemes would have some important roles in the language itself. But also more crucially, in Indo-European languages such as English, segmental and suprasegmental cues add almost like an extra layer which contains some information about a person's emotional states. So for example, if you read the same word, really, it could communicate the different emotional states of the person who says that. So you could go with really or really. They are both asking for further clarification or further information, but there is an extra layer of emotional information. But in tonal languages, things are a bit more complicated. So I'm going to use the example from Mandarin Chinese because that's what they used in this particular studies. So in Mandarin Chinese, we have 5 tones. The fifth one, the neutral tone, sometimes called silent tone, is usually used at the end of a question. So we're focusing on the first 4 tones. The same acoustic dimension, meaning the pitch of the sound, could perform 2 very different functions. So the first one is they help to distinguish between different lexical meanings. So if you pronounce the pitch in a different manner, the meaning of that term, of that word, changes. And on top of that, they also carries some information about emotion. So it could perform as an emotional signals. And this is what this particular line of research is focusing on. And then the result is that even when the tone itself is lexically contrastive, it still correlates with affective dimension, and the same acoustic contour could serve these twofold functions. So the experiment involved in this particular line of research is they carried out a few experiments, but the main idea is to ask the participants to rate affective information in terms of arousal and balance using a series of bisyllabic words from 2 main corpora. And also they're going to do the same thing with nonce words, meaning they don't necessarily carry any concrete lexical meaning. So the 2 existing corpus data set, one is called Chinese Affective Word System, and the other one is called Affective Norms for Chinese words. So they both contain bisyllabic words. Some of them will be nouns, others will be adjectives or verbs. And then they measure 2 affective dimensions. One is arousal, which indicates the intensity of activation level of a particular emotion, how exciting it is. And the other one is called valence, which indicates the emotional quality ranging from negative emotion to positive emotion. So this is very much in line with the work done by Lisa Fredman Barrett and James Russell. And what they found in this particular experiment is that for lexical tones in Mandarin Chinese, they can reliably predict arousal rating. So if we go from a very high place and then you drop down to a low place, which is the falling tone, the 4th tone in Mandarin Chinese, chances are you are getting a higher arousal. So I've got 2 examples here. So the first one, meaning irritable, and the 2 characters all carry the fourth tone. And then there's another one meaning excited, and then the first character is first tone, and then the second character is the fourth tone. So they both contain a falling tone, and then they found that this leads to a higher arousal in the rating from the participant. On the other hand, if you have a rising tone, which rises from a relatively low place to a high place, or you have a low dipping tone, which is the third tone. So the low dipping meaning it drops a little bit to the bottom and then it rises up. And this usually results in low arousal. So again, those two examples, one contains first tone and second tone, and then the second one contains second tone and the third tone. So arousal, even though it's from works done in social constructivism, could also be interpreted using variables Tim mentioned earlier from appraisal theory. So in this case, arousal reflects the appraisal of novelty and salience. Is the input unexpected, or how salient that input is? So what they found in this study suggests that low-level acoustic patterns, such as the pitch contour of individual tonemes, could bias affective weighting, meaning how accessible the affective information is. Do you process that information early? Which has something to do with the priority of information integration. So this is about the tones in the fact that they could predict arousal rating. And then for valence, it's a little bit, this is where the interesting stuff comes in, because valence effects are usually very weak in general lexicon. So when they analyze corpus-based data, they didn't necessarily observe any significant valence effect. But if you use nouns word, meaning that the semantic condition has been reduced to the minimum, the effect on whether a term could be interpreted as positive or negative become very, very much significant. So if you look at the chart here, which I did a screenshot from the 2025 research, the color shades, different color shades represent the expected frequency. So if you have a blue shade, meaning the frequency is actually higher than they expected, and then the red shade meaning, refers to where you notice lower than expected frequencies. So the nouns words they use here are two sound combination. One is titu, the other is ninu. Neither of them carries any lexical meaning in Mandarin Chinese, and they did with combinations of 4 different tones. And what they found is that for the combination of the first and second tone, the valence tend to be rated as positive. And then they explain it in terms of the page contour of the tonemes, as you can see from the graph on the right, both the first tone and second tone. So the first tone remains at very high pitch, so it's usually considered as more positive. The second one involves an upward contour, which is also more likely to be interpreted as positive. And in contrast to that, if you have the nouns word combination consists of the fourth tone, which involves a very fast pitch variation. It dropped downward very quickly from high place to a low place, and this usually leads to negative valence. And they didn't necessarily explain why the third tone would have similar effects, because the third tone also have that rising contour following a drop. So that would be something I personally would be very interested in to see why the effect is not that much evident in the third tone. So what we can get from here is that valence, if we interpret it from the perspective of appraisal theory, it reflects the appraisal of goal congruence, whether it goes aligns with the goal or it goes against the goal. But at the same time, it's crucial to point out that goal relevance is not the same thing as salient. You could have something that's very much salient, but it doesn't necessarily mean it aligns with your goal. So this seems to suggest that the appraisal dimension might work on different layers. You could have arousal, which usually concerns low-level salience weighting, and then on top of that, you could have another layer, which concerns a high-level goal integration, and that's usually reflected in the rating for valence. So if appraisal operates at different layers, then in tonal languages such as Mandarin Chinese, these layers would be simultaneously activated by the same acoustic input, the tones. But what we saw earlier about their findings suggests that there might be a bit of a competition for accessibilities between two tracks. So the first one is the lexical track, where tonemes contributes to the lexical meaning of the term, which is their primary function. So this track is usually very fast, it's automatic, it's mandatory, and it's usually very strong in Mandarin Chinese. And then the other track is prosodic track. Compared to the lexical one, this one is much weaker and it's usually masked in general lexicon, unless in reduced semantic conditions, which we saw earlier in nonce word. So for tonemes in normal speech, lexical decoding is mandatory, but the effective weighting is optional. So the lexical track generally dominates. But in reduced semantic conditions, the prosodic effects become more visible and perhaps more reliable as well. So this suggests that non-propositional acoustic cues, such as tonemes, modulate propositional processing in very subtle ways, even when the cues also have a lexical function, which is usually not acknowledged. It's usually not that obvious for Indo-European languages, and it's generally not acknowledged when it comes to studies on tonemes in general. And also, this also suggests that the strength of competition between these two tracks are constrained by context, depending on whether we have a normal semantic condition or reduced semantic condition. So that's the first line of research I'd like to mention. And then the other one is about neuroactivity in emotional prosody production. Why we need to know a bit more about neuroactivity is because if low-level acoustic patterns bias effective weighting in any way, it needs to have some sort of grounding in our neural architecture. And this study looks specifically at that. The experiments is actually quite straightforward. They ask participants to produce emotional prosody, meaning in happy tone, in angry tone, or in a neutral tone. And they ask the participants to produce those prosody in normal speech, which you will be having both the sound and vibration from the vocal folds, and in whisper condition, where you don't have you have the sound, but not necessarily the vibration, and also in silent articulation where you don't have any. And they asked the participants to do that in an fMRI scanner. And there are quite a few things they found, but here are the three things that I believe to be more interesting. So the first one is that the production of emotional prosody recruits a shared network, which is usually involved in both perception and production of emotional prosody. They observed activation in a whole range of area. So the first one is called temporal voice areas, or TVA for short. That is a brain area that's usually participated in the perception of emotional prosody. But at the same time, it's also involved in giving feedback and monitoring information. And they also observed activations in the insular cortex, in motor or mental sensory cortex. So all those areas are involved not just in production or perception, they're actually involved in both. So this seems to suggest that emotional expression is not a byproduct of perception, but it's also embedded within the same network. Then the second finding they have is that vocal fold vibrations contributes to multisensory integration. So they observed significant activations in this particular part of the insula, the left mid-insula, during normal speech, where you have vibrations from of the vocal fold. And this particular region is known for taking care of many things, including speech movement executives, interoceptive awareness, emotional experience, and of course, multisensory integration. So if you observe activations from this particular region, then it seems to suggest that those low-level bodily signal, meaning the vibrations, can modulate how information is integrated from different modalities of the brain. And then the last finding is that greater activations and more widespread activities are observed for happiness rather than anger, which is the one thing that they noticed that goes against previous research. And their interpretation of that finding is that for happy prosody, you might need more complex modulation, or that modulation takes more cognitive effort. Whereas anger might be expressed more automatically. It's easier to produce an angry tone of voice, and it involves less variability. So they hypothesize, they didn't necessarily go too much into that direction, that the area, the TVA, which is the area primarily responsible for the perception of emotional prosody, might encode some emotion-specific vocal features, and that's probably why you could differentiate different effective information carried by different emotional prosody. So far, everything has been remained at a relatively lower level or early stage of the production of emotional prosody. But it also suggests that you could have appraisal happening at different layers. So you could have vocal fold vibrations function as interoceptive signals that are integrated in the insular cortex. And this suggests that those non-propositional cues could already guide attention allocation very early on in the information processing. And then another layer, which involves the cerebellum and the sensory cortex, would support there is a dynamic integration of what you expect to receive and what you actually receive. So there is this error check between expected input and actual input, which allows subtle adjustment. So this seems to suggest that evaluation of accessibility and priority may occur during the integration of multisensory information rather than only at a later referential stage. So feedback from vibrations in regions such as what has been mentioned before implies that acoustic salience biases accessibility, but so far it's not yet goal-level valuation. And something I find especially interesting is that it also observed activation in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is one of the high-level valuation systems, which leads to an open question: would those vibrations, would those bodily feedback goes up to reach this sort of higher level valuation system, such as the PFC? So here's where the works done by Matthew Lieberman comes into the picture, because he mostly, well, one of the things he works on is about processing affective signals or social signals. So for example, facial expressions and emotional expressions, how the processing of those signals may engage this high-level valuation system. So if we do have bodily feedback going up to the higher levels, that would suggest that those low-level bodily signal may also shape goal relevance appraisal, and not just taking care of where you designate your attention to. So the critical question is not necessarily whether emotional signals are processed, but how far up the hierarchy their influence might extend. So I'm passing it over to Tim for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Mengyang. I think those two areas are really exciting. Um, I do realize that over the past sort of 50 minutes or so, we've given you a lot of information, um, a lot of theory, and a lot of probably quite new ideas on both prosody and the stuff from tone language and also the neuroscientific stuff. But I want to close with just two quick points. I've called these the take home message, but I think arguably it's take home messages. The first of these is that we've certainly in relevance theory focused on propositional information. And if any of you have read the paper that I wrote with Danny Jukes, Constant Bonnard, David Sander, and Steve Oswald from 2021, we equated very much relevance theory with what you might call higher level cognitive processes. I think it's probably clear to say that that was a little bit of an exaggeration, because if you really go back to the original volume of relevance and especially look at the new work by Sperber and Wilson, it's very clear that the notion of inference and the derivation of relevance takes place at different levels. This is a short quote from their most recent paper. The strength of neural signals is modulated at every step in information processing by brain mechanisms that locally implement bottom-up and top-down biases in attention. These mechanisms favor processing more relevant inputs in greater depth and thus contribute to overall cognitive efficiency. So there's much more to the derivation of relevance than the manipulation of conceptual representations and propositions. And the second point to make, which relates to the questions that I raised earlier about how we could go about uniting relevance theory and appraisal theory, the role of emotion in communication, and the role of emotion in inference. Understanding this really gets us towards answering those questions, I think. Appraisals are part of a very complex, multi-layered process, and they involve the search for relevance in ways that perhaps we haven't yet explored. And I reiterate, this is very much work in progress. So I'm sorry there aren't any answers. There are just a whole load more questions, but that's better to be asking new questions than perhaps staying with the same ones. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you to my colleague Mingyang for helping. And here are some references. The Damasio experiment is reported in the book there, and there are various other references. Thank you for some warm applause echoes around my empty bedroom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with those questions in mind, we'll open the floor to questions. We have 5, maybe 10 minutes for questions. People are clapping. I need the claps to subside and the hands to go up. You can put a virtual hand up, you can unmic and speak, you can wave at me. Agnieszka waving at me like a human being.
Okay, just because there is silence, and I'm so inspired. I'm not sure if I have anything interesting to contribute. Thank you so much, team, and Mengyang, for your very interesting presentation. And just a thought to share, because I think in order to incorporate all these findings and new areas of research, maybe it will be necessary somehow to rethink the terminology, because I think we are all very much biased by the fact that we have the relevance is about positive cognitive effects. And it's cognitive, right? So in the very definition, we have positive cognitive effects. And this is something a little bit like biasing us, or has been biasing us over the years, and maybe I will just share that in a recent project that I've done with my colleagues, we discussed like an instance of intercultural communication, very specific instance. And since we are incorporating relevance theory, I suggested that maybe we will just use the term positive effects, because in this particular instance, the emotional impacts of those exchanges was very, very important and couldn't be ignored. So just this. But I would like to thank you once again.
Thank you, Agnieszka. Sorry, I said Maria then because Maria's name is right in front of my screen suddenly. Mengyang, shall I take this?
Yes, please.
Yeah. I think thank you very much, Agnieszka. And Agnieszka's always incredibly modest and humble about this, but she wrote a paper about emotion and affect and relevance long ago, which was a great inspiration to me and has inspired me over the years. So thank you for that. I think we certainly are, as relevance theorists, I don't know if biased is the right word, but we've certainly been led into a certain area by this phrase positive cognitive effects. I suppose ultimately whether we just call them positive effects or positive cognitive effects depends very much on what we mean by cognitive. So part of the thinking in the book that Louis and I wrote about introducing the term affective effects was to bring this whole new range of effects to the table, as it were. But certainly in my thinking over the last 2 or 3 years and since that book was written, I think what we really need to be doing is broadening what we mean by cognition. So when I talk about cognition, I'm not really just thinking about cognitive effects being strengthened or weakened or contradicted anymore. I'm thinking about cognition in a much broader term, in a way that encompasses affect. And I suspect that the term affective effects, which was around in one book for about a year, will probably die out and it will just be part of cognitive effects. I mean, just to say one further thing, because I can see other hands are up. I was recently in a meeting, in fact, this week in a meeting with a group of affective scientists from the center in Geneva. And one of them said, well, in fact, the director of the center said, well, but surely emotions are cognitive effects, aren't they? And I mean, I sort of had to say, well, yeah, they are, but they're not if you think about cognitive effects as defined in a particular way. Certainly as defined in the way that I present cognitive effects when I teach relevance theory. So I think there's a certain amount of, I don't think it's much more than just changing our view of terms that we use. I'm not sure if the terms need to change, but emotion is in there right at the start. I mean, one of the really exciting things about the work that Mengyang was presenting is that propositional processing, so the very process of doing what we do when we take conceptual representations and process them, is modulated by emotion from the very earliest stage on. So we have to find a way of accommodating that. And I suspect, I mean, I would be perfectly happy to talk about positive effects as well. Perhaps it's not quite precise enough, and perhaps what we need to do is rethink what we mean by cognitive and make sure that when we use that term, we embrace affect as well. Hope that was an answer of kinds. Kate, I'll leave you to chair and choose between these hands.
I'll go in the order the hands went up. So Ishmael was next.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. So thank you very much, Mengyang and Tim, for this wonderful presentation. All of this sounds very promising, and my question was, well, concerned, you had a very sensible way to approach how you try to explain goal relevance in terms of cog-rel, and which is very, I mean, it's the logical step to do since we have a definition for relevance and they have a much blurrier one. So my question would be, does this exchange only go one way, or we also get new, I mean, with your work, cog-rel, or more like relevance as we know it, should also get new ideas from appraisal theory, new notions we should incorporate. You started already answering a bit this question by saying that we should broaden cognition as a whole, but what specifically should we also, well, include in our understanding of relevance in that regard?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, I'll just say I'll start, and Mengyang, feel free to jump in whenever you want. I mean, the first thing to say is it is very much a two-way thing. In fact, I was conscious halfway through giving that talk, and perhaps because I'm sensitive to the audience, I was conscious of the fact that I'm sort of saying, well, we can replace this notion of goal relevance with our notion of cog relevance. It's very much a two-way thing. All the insights on neurology, which Mengyang reported in the second area of empirical work, is work taking place within appraisal theory in affective science. So from that to that extent, all of these ideas about the ways that propositional content is modulated by emotion, and this whole idea that there is some kind of interoceptive and exteroceptive loop which is constantly guiding us, in almost the kind of embodied way, if I dare use that term in a relevance researchers network meeting, is really exciting. So all that's coming from appraisal theory. The other part of appraisal theory, which I'm finding really useful, is they have a slightly more, I mean, when we talk about the mind, we're quite committed to post-Fodorian modularity, and we're all still, I think, very influenced by Fodor, and of course Dan's really good work on modules. And but they also have really interesting insights on the mind, many of which are actually backed up by neurological work, which, as far as I know, is not something in relevance theory that we talk very much about, neurology. And I think that would be a really useful way to go. I have a PhD student, Joe Reynolds, who did a master's in neuro linguistics and neuroscience, and I mean, I think he has insights into neurology and things. So it's most certainly a two-way exchange, and I feel very lucky to have met many of the people I've already met. And for those of you who are coming to our event in April in Geneva, I hope that will also be a kind of melting pot of, I know some people here are coming to that. So yeah, it's a really, really good question. Actually really important to remember that this is not about relevance theory armies invading territory previously occupied by appraisal theorists. I know that wouldn't happen in Switzerland because you're all neutral there, but yeah, anyway.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I do have a very quick comment to make. Well, first of all, that's indeed a very important question. And to be honest, when Tim and I were having this advisory group meeting, one of the questions we asked the appraisal scientist on the panel was whether what we are doing now sort of seems to be simplifying the whole concept, because I think that's indeed a very important issue to address. We're not, like Tim said, it's a very much two-way thing. And what we're trying to do is not just simply getting rid of terminologies from one theory, but to see how we can sort of incorporate ideas from these two, relatively speaking, independent field of studies, but find a place where we could find some common ground for that. And also, like Tim just said, one of the challenges I think relevant theory usually faces is with the empirical side of it. I am aware that there is this paper published written by Sperber and Mercier or Sperber and Vanderheist, quite a few years ago, where they did experiments to see how you can address the relevance in a more empirical way. But nonetheless, we still need to go, I think we still need to go a bit further than that, because if you have something going on in the mind, the chances are it's going to reflect it in some way in the neural network of it, which is why I really like the work done by the neurologist in the center in Geneva. They're actually helping us to build our argument and to see the notion we have been using for quite a few years might turn out to be more complex than we previously thought.
Very much. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to let the session overrun a little bit. If obviously people need to leave, they're free to do so, but we'll keep the conversation going while it's going. Fabrizio.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah, hello. So thank you, Tim and Menyang, for the very thought-provoking speech. As you know, I'm working on simultaneous interpreting, and we'll be dealing with that within this network and the conference that you mentioned, Tim. And time and again, so we're looking at how prosodic features convey effect in simultaneous interpreting. Obviously, it's a cross-cultural and cross-linguistic environment. And it's hard, first and foremost, because you need to recognize how different languages deal with prosody. But what I find time and again is that, interpreters are able to analyze these nonverbal behaviors, how they communicate emotional stance, intensity, tension. But they obviously have to channel all this into prosody because their means is voice. So you have to kind of unpack all these affective cues and use prosody to guide your listeners' attention, your trigger emotional evaluation, etc., just with one means. So my question to you is, because I'm ignorant in affective science, is can affective science help us kind of identify this different affective cues? I'm thinking in terms of training now, interpreter training. Can it help us identify the different affective cues and to help the interpreter kind of, reproduce, attenuate, recalibrate effective information through their prosodic choices? Is there like a classification?
Well, thank you, Fabrizio. I mean, I think that's a really, well, it's a very interesting question, but it's actually very exciting to me because I think there are a whole range of what you might call real world applications to this work. The short answer is I don't know of any guide or anything that you could download and put to use in your work on interpreting. However, when you come to the conference, Fabrizio, you will, I think, I mean, unless you've visited the website of CESA already, the Swiss Centre for Effective Sciences, you will see that they have so many different programs going on. I mean, they're not just interested in hard science. There's a huge social outreach element to them. I think there is even, I don't know whether there's anything which is on interpreting, but there's certainly people working on translation. So, I mean, there are, I can't remember what it's called, but there is a particular system that they use of actually measuring certain emotions, which is you can actually download from their website. Yeah, I mean, I'm really grasping at straws, but I'm sure there are practical applications for the work that they do. I'd like to think that there are practical applications for the work that we're doing with them as well. And if I remember, and if you remind me, when we do meet in April, I'll introduce you to the person that I'm thinking of who works on particularly on translation. And I think I hope that there will be, really useful ways that you can interact with them and help you in your, quite frankly, interpreting always seems to me to be a totally impossible task. How it's even done is a miracle to me. So there are applications. I don't know of any in particular. I don't know if Mingyang, if you have anything to add here, because Mingyang is fluent in lots of
Well,
languages.
first of all, I'm not fluent in many other languages. And also interpreting is indeed something that I had a bit of training when I was doing my undergrad program, but not necessarily anything beyond that. So I'm quite ignorant of that as well. I was just going to make a quick comment. I think I might have, I'm not quite sure, but I might have seen something like interpretation or interpreting on the CISA website. But yeah, this is something I probably need to have a closer look at because they are doing quite a very wide range of things. And the social aspects, it's certainly something that they are working on. So I won't be surprised that they will be having something on interpretation. Sorry, I'm not necessarily providing any new information for that. But yeah.
It's fine, thank you. We'll keep on discussing on it when we see each
Yeah.
other,
Thank
in
you, Fabrizio.
face to face. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Ricardo?
Yes, hi. Can everybody hear me?
Hi, Ricardo.
Oh, good. Thank you. First off, thank you for this presentation, and I'll say it's exciting to see so many people interested in these topics. It's a warm feeling for me. My question is, I was wondering if you could think of implications for applying these insights to written communication. Because I was thinking, I know that's what some researchers of relevance theory have done, but also as we read texts, we also employ tonality, and it's surely separated to a degree from what authors intended. We add that tonality, right? But relevance theory would argue that since authors expected a certain reading, perhaps a certain tonality to go with it as well. So it might be a bit detached from what you were talking, but if any on the margin thoughts you could share, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Mengyang, I wonder if, because Mengyang and I have recently written a chapter about relevance, emotion, and literature. And I wonder, Mengyang, if you have any, but because Mengyang has introduced me to lots of interesting Chinese literature and Chinese poetry, and we've used examples of Chinese literature and Chinese poems in the work that we're doing. Mengyang, can you bear it if I pass this to you? Because I think you're better on this stuff than I am.
Um, well, I mean that first of all, that's a huge compliment. But the chapter, the handbook chapter Tim mentioned, in that chapter we mostly talk about how emotions can be communicated in literary works, and not necessarily through this specific trajectory of emotional prosody. Although I think that's a really to be honest, I've never actually given it much thought until you brought it up. And I do think that's a very interesting way to go. Um, but on the topic of literary context or on the topic of written communication, and the way I see that we could apply some of the ideas from this project is to sort of explain what's going on when we are reading literature using some of the variables that has been proposed by appraisal theory. So, for example, what's going on with this novelty? How do we gauge certain information to be unexpected? And if it's unexpected, it might lead to a specific or sometimes even very strong emotional experience. A very quick example would be you could read the same piece of text multiple times. There is literally no absolutely new information for you from that piece of work. But every time you read it, you still get emotional experience, and chances are you might have slightly different or dramatically different emotional experience every time you read that. In order to explain that, can we use some of the variables from appraisal theory? I do believe we can. So novelty would be something that comes into play. Again, control is probably another thing. So I'm still fairly very much a novice in terms of this particular area. And certainly I'm not very well informed in terms of how we approach emotional prosody in literary work. But I do think that's a very promising field for further collaboration and further exploration. I know I'm not necessarily answering your question, but that's what I'm thinking at the moment.
I agree that it's a really interesting question. It's not something that I had thought about either, but we unquestionably do it, especially when we're reading, you know, free direct speech and things like that. We sort of impose tone, prosody on it, and that's a crucial part of our understanding or our interpretation of what the layers of emotion that the reader is laying on the words. I don't have much of an answer, Ricardo, I'm afraid, but I think it's a really interesting point. And if you could think of ways that, you know, these kind of ideas might be applied, I'd be really interested to hear them.
Thank you. Yeah, I think
So,
there's.
can I just make another very quick comment because it literally just jumped out of my mind? There is indeed a field of research in terms of language, I mean, in Mandarin Chinese, in terms of the evolution of spoken language, how the sound sort of evolved during time, because many of the classical poems, when they were written, the language was actually spoken in a very much different way. So some of the terms might not be even pronounced in the same way as they are currently. And there is indeed a field of research in terms of how that change might probably contribute to the interpretation of the reading of that particular piece of poetry. I'm not sure how far that could overlap with emotional prosody, but at least that's something to do with the sound in which is appreciated in literary context.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm thinking Asian literature that was also written to be, as you said, read out loud, epistolary literature that was sent out, and people would listen to it more than read it. There will be one reader, but it was a collective experience, and they were listening, and tonality made an impact. So thank you so much for that. And I wonder if you could remind me the name of the handbook so I can look for that chapter.
What's it called, Miguel?
Bloomsbury's Handbook of Pragmatics and Literature. I think that's probably it. It's not yet out.
Oh, okay.
We've just
No, it's
finished with the revision and yeah,
it'll be out next year, I think.
next year. Okay.
If you want to drop me a line, Ricardo, I'll let you know when it's published. Just send me a quick email.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody. I think the fact that we've gone over 20 minutes is testament to the quality of the discussion and debate and interest in
the poor time management of the lead speaker, I think.
No, not at all, not at all. So we will round up there. Thank you very much. Lovely to see so many people. We have another session in a month, the last Friday of March. So hopefully see some of you there. I'll be sending out details soon and it'll also be on the webpage. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.